By the 1st century BC, the Roman Republic had developed an absolute addiction to expansion. They had turned into an aggressive, ultra-militaristic machine, swallowing up neighboring territories until they controlled roughly 10% of the entire human population. But this sheer scale created a massive logistical glitch. The Senate was sitting back in the capital trying to direct campaigns happening thousands of miles away. As the borders pushed further outward, the central government simply lost the ability to directly manage or fund these endless long-term deployments. This diagram illustrates exactly what went wrong. When the state couldn't pay the troops on time, the soldiers' loyalty severed its connection to the abstract idea of the Roman Senate. Instead, that allegiance rerouted directly to the commanders standing right in front of them. These generals realized they could secure that devotion by making personal promises. They told their men that if they won the campaign, they would be rewarded with direct cuts of the looted wealth and grants of conquered land. The men fought for the payout, not the republic. Rome was essentially operating as a fractured collection of private warlords, all competing against each other for resources under the thin disguise of a single flag. Julius Caesar was the ultimate product of this broken system. He marched into Gaul with a relatively small force and spent years dismantling the region, forging a hardened army that held absolute personal devotion only to him. When the Senate tried to strip him of his command, Caesar simply weaponized that private army. He marched his veterans directly on the Roman capital, completely bypassing the Senate's legal authority with pure physical force. The Senate panicked, and in a desperate attempt to hit the reset button, a group of politicians murdered Caesar in the middle of a meeting, convinced that killing the dictator would somehow save the Republic. The assassination accomplished absolutely nothing. The Republic was already dead because the central government no longer held a monopoly on military violence. Enter Augustus, Rome's first official emperor. He looked at the smoking ruins of a century of civil war and perfectly diagnosed the crisis. A soldier's loyalty will always flow to whoever writes the checks. He initiated a radical intervention. Augustus outlawed private militias entirely and built Rome's first permanent professional standing army, funded directly and exclusively by the imperial treasury. Soldiers now enlisted for 20-year terms. The state guaranteed them regular paychecks, standardized equipment, and crucially, a secure retirement package of land or cash upon discharge. The commander no longer held the purse strings. To keep this massive, expensive force occupied without destabilizing the state, Augustus halted the cycle of endless expansion. He instructed the legions to dig in and build hardened, physical borders to contain the empire geographically. By literally purchasing the military's allegiance back from rogue generals, Augustus successfully bought Rome 2 centuries of relative stability, launching its golden age. But the Augustan system contained a fatal side effect: the Praetorian Guard. This was an elite, heavily armed military unit permanently stationed right inside the capital, originally created simply to protect the emperor. Decades later, Emperor Tiberius abandoned the capital and moved to an island compound, leaving the city behind to live in complete isolation. This physical disconnect created an enormous power vacuum back in Rome. The Praetorian Guard quickly realized their leverage. Because they controlled who got to physically walk into the room with the isolated emperor, they effectively controlled the entire empire. This abuse of power escalated rapidly over the next century. The Guard began actively assassinating emperors who wouldn't cooperate with their demands, and eventually reached a point where they literally auctioned off the throne to the highest bidder. The structure of the state had completely regressed. Rome was once again being held hostage by the men holding the swords. They were just wearing different uniforms this time. The rapid turnover of emperors and the endless civil wars driven by the Praetorians threw Rome into chaos. These constant internal battles permanently fractured the empire, splitting it into separate, vulnerable halves. Right as Rome's administration was at its weakest, an external crisis hit. Violent Hunnic migration sweeping across Eurasia forced tens of thousands of desperate Gothic tribes right to the Roman border, begging for asylum. The Roman administration agreed to let them in, but corrupt border officials starved and exploited the refugees so severely that the Goths finally snapped and triggered a massive revolt. 2 years into the uprising, the rebellion reached a terrifying climax. The Goths slaughtered a massive Roman army and killed an acting emperor right on the battlefield. Rome learned a terrifying lesson that day. They were no longer safely integrating new populations. They were actively importing fully formed enemy armies directly into their own territory. Bleeding territory and cash, the Western Empire resorted to a desperate survival tactic. They began outsourcing their defense, actively trading chunks of their own land to these armed foreign groups just to get them to stop pillaging. Giving away land like North Africa severed Rome from its grain and its tax base. Without money to pay traditional soldiers, the state became entirely dependent on Germanic mercenary armies, who held no cultural loyalty to the concept of Rome. That dependency set up the incredibly anticlimactic end of the Western Empire in 476 AD. There was no epic final siege. A Germanic mercenary commander simply walked in, politely told the last sitting emperor that his services were no longer required, and retired him. The ultimate lesson of the Roman collapse is straightforward. High walls and vast borders cannot save a state if the central government loses control over exactly who its military is fighting for.